All right, so I'm going to start with just obviously some just logistical stuff on this test. So again, part 1 is tomorrow. Part 1 is 64 points of the total. Part 2 is going to be much more brief. That's 36 points. It's 6 questions, but those are fast. So part 1 has everything that was on your quiz, which is basically what's on this screen. 6-1, the degrees to radians and radians to degrees. The coterminal in radians, because last time we did it last test, you did it in degrees, you're going to do it in radians. The arc length, which is S equals theta times the radius. And area of a sector, which is theta times 1/2 times the radius squared. And keep in mind that theta has to be in radians. So biggest mistake on the quiz on those questions was that. You have to put those angles into radians. So you have to switch them from degrees into radians. Let me group this so that I can move it. Okay. That was all your 6-1 stuff. So expect question, radian degrees, coterminal, arc length, area of a sector, all that kind of stuff would come from 6-1. So there's no calculator on this one. You don't need a scientific. You're not going to get a basic 4 function, nothing. You get no calculator on this one. That stuff will be saved for Friday. Then 6-2 was finding the trig functions of any angles. So this is your finding things like the sine of 14 pi over 3 or the cosecant of 11 pi over 2, stuff like that, where you need to know well your unit circle. Know that every over 6 is root 3 over 2 1/2, and the tangent is root 3 over 3. Know that every over 4 is root 2 over 2, root 2 over 2, tangent is 1. And every over 3 is 1/2, and root 3 over 2, and the tangent is root 3. The cosines are the x's, the sines are the y's, okay? And then also know that all students take calculus because obviously as you move around your circle, you want to know which sign to take, positive or negative. 6-3 was the reverse. So I'm going to give you the trig function. You're going to give me the angle on your entire circle from 0 to 2 pi. So mistakes made on that on your test were not including both, or quiz, sorry, not including both terms. Almost every single one of those questions has 2 answers. One on the review even has all 4 because it's plus or minus, which if you've already seen it, you know what I'm talking about. So that's all from your quiz. So again, I'll go over some feedback on the quiz, but this is kind of an overview of this kind of stuff for your test. Then what got added on is section 6.4 and 6.5. You're only going to have one of each of these, but they are 12 points apiece. So you're either going to have the sine and the secant, because that would cause you, that would cause you to graph sine and cosine, or you're going to have cosine and cosecant, because that will cause you to graph cosine and sine. Well, if you don't know Friday's lesson, it's good. That's kind of the basic of it. So if I say to graph cosecant, for example, then I'm first graphing sine, right? And then I would plot and then I would draw my asymptotes, and then I would plot my curves. So by graphing cosecant, you're forced to graph sine. If I tell you to graph secant, then you have to start with cosine. So you'd start with cosine, you'd drop it down, you draw your asymptotes, you'd plot your curves. So you're either going to get sine and secant, because sine by itself you'd graph sine, but secant you'd graph cosine. Does that make sense? So you're going to get, there's only one of each. You're either getting sine or cosine, and then you're getting the other one's reciprocal function. So technically you're graphing both. So if you get cosine, then you're going to get cosecant, because cosecant makes you graph sine. Yeah, your question 1 will be cosine or sine. Question 2 will be secant or cosecant.
But it'll say graph the cos. It's going to say graph the secant.
And you have to know that means graph cosine and then graph secant. Yeah.
Why did you do the
Because you're either getting sine and secant or you're getting cosine and cosecant. You know what? Just know how to graph all of them and ignore my crisscross. I was trying to help you out, but that confused you more. So just ignore it. There are 2 separate questions. Question 1 is going to be sine or cosine.
Isn't secant cosine?
Yes. That's the point. So if number 1 is sine, then number 2 will be secant because you'll have to graph cosine. So in the end, you're going to end up graphing both. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay.
And then if number 1 is cosine, then number 2 will be cosecant because that's going to force you to graph sine and you end up graphing both. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. And if that confused you, I'm very sorry. Just ignore it and just be prepared to do all 4. Yeah. So either way, you have to know how to graph all 4. Okay? But you're only graphing 2 questions. Okay. So let me do one of the examples first and then I'll go quiz. With these, the actual question itself is going to give you the function like y equals whatever, which I'll show you when I do the homework. I'll do it like it does on the quiz. It's going to ask you for the amplitude. It's going to ask you for the period. It's going to ask you for a vertical shift, a phase shift, and a reflection on the physical quiz itself on Canvas. You're going to type those in. Then your graph with your key points is going to go on your answer sheet. You're going to graph 2 full periods. So when I do the question from the homework, we're going to practice that because on Friday we did 1 period, but I'm going to show you how to just duplicate it to get the second one. You're going to graph 2 full periods for both questions. Okay, so this is question 6 from the homework, but I'm going to do it as though it's a test question, okay? So ignore the format that was on WebAssign. And let's say that this is my question. So y equals negative secant pi x plus 1. The first thing I'm going to know is that I have to, from this graph, y equals negative cosine pi x plus 1 because secant is the reciprocal cosine. So then on Canvas, it's going to say it's going to say amplitude equals. It's going to say period equals. It's going to say phase shift equals. It's going to say vertical shift equals. And then the rest of it's going to go on your answer sheet. So the amplitude, my A is negative 1, which means I'm going to flip it upside down. And the amplitude is the absolute value of that, which is 1. So then I'm going to type that in on Canvas. Amplitude is 1. The B is what's in between the trig function and the x, which in this case is pi. And the period is 2 pi over b, which in this case means the period is 2. And I'm going to type that in on Canvas. Say again. It's 2 pi over pi, so the pi's cancel. Okay. Is there a phase shift on this example? No. No, so I will literally type in the little box, none. Is there a vertical shift on this example? Yep, this is up 1. So I'm just going to put a positive 1 in there. If it was down 1, I'd put a negative 1.
So the phase shift is when it's in parentheses and vertical.
Correct.
And
Yep.
putting those, that gets you points.
Yeah?
Okay.
Yeah. And you guys will just write it on your answer sheet. They'll type it in. I don't know if you're going to be here or not, but you'll type it in if you're at home, okay? Then comes the key points, right? So I take the period, which is 2. I start at 0. I take the period and multiply it times 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and I end at the period, which is 2. So first key point is 0. Second is 1/2. Third is 1. Fourth is 3/2, and the last one is 2. That's going to go on your actual, so I give you the graph on your answer sheet, and then you're going to plot those on that. So it's going to say 0, 1/2, 1, 3/2, 2. Now here's what's important. Remember I said you're going to have to graph 2 periods? You take all those coordinate points and duplicate them negative. So without a phase shift, that's all you have to do. So if I wanted to know what my second period was, this would be negative 1/2, negative 1, negative 3/2, and negative 2. And I should have drawn that over here so that I can, there we go. So now I'm going to extend that 1/2, negative 1/2, negative 1. Because it's going to ask for 2 full periods. Like the homework asked for it, and so will your test. So I'm just duplicating them negative. That's all.
That's all you have to do.
Yeah, when there's a phase shift, I'll show you what to do there. This one doesn't have phase shift, so it's super easy. You just make them negative. There's no such thing as a negative 0, so it stays 0. You're going to at least have one that has a phase shift. Yeah. You're going to have one that has a phase shift. You're going to have one that has a reflection. You're going to have one that has a vertical shift. It's just the combination where it is. So one might have 2 of those 3. The other one might have 1. Does it? Upside down. This one's upside down. Yeah. Okay, so then it's cosine. So normally I would plot my amplitude, and cosine would start at the 1, come down, down, up, up. But because it's negative, we're going to actually start it at the negative 1, come up, up, down, down. And then the pattern just reverses to the other side. Okay. And I'm here so far. Now there's a vertical shift up 1, but remember on Friday I said it's very important that you find your asymptotes before you shift it, because the asymptotes come directly wherever there's an x-intercept before you shift it. So I'm going to draw through here my asymptote, this asymptote, this asymptote, this asymptote. Then I'm going to shift everything up 1. I just did 2 on 1 here. And then my parabolas bounce off of those maximums and minimums. That's the answer. Yep.
Because it said, it's because it started off with secant, doesn't matter.
Secant is why we did the asymptotes and the parabolas. If it was just cosine, it would have been the blue one.
You don't like flip the graph or anything.
We flipped it when it was cosine because it was negative. So instead of starting, normally we would have started up. Like normally you would start up, down, down, up, up.
No, I'm saying because it's secant.
Secant just means take everything and flip them out. So we take this and then we flip it up, out.
Okay.
So the parabola instead of a
Change
curve.
this pattern.
Correct. All right, so let me do one more. Anybody have another question from the homework, or I'm just going to grab a random one? Okay, so now we've got cosecant, which means we're going to graph sine with a phase shift. So I would start by doing 4 sine x minus pi. I'm going to answer the same things: the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, the vertical shift, and then we're going to put our key points. And how come it's not writing? Hang on. Pause. Resume. There we go. Okay. We're going to answer those there. We're going to put our key points, and we're going to do 2 full periods, okay, on our, like it would be the answer sheet. So I'd start with A being 4, which is my amplitude. I just wrote 2. That's 4. B is 1 because it's what's in between the sine and the x, which means my period is 2 pi, and I'll write it as 2 pi on canvas. This time the phase shift, I'm going to set this equal to 0, and I get x equals pi. So pi is my phase shift. If it was negative, I would put negative pi. And there's no vertical shift, so I'm going to put the word none. Now I would do my key points. So I would start at 0. I would do 2 pi times a fourth, 2 pi times a half, 2 pi times 3/4, and the last one is the period, which is 2 pi. So this is 0, 2 pi. This becomes pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2. We've done those a bunch, right? And then 2 pi. Those are our standard key points. And then I'm going to duplicate them as though they're negative to get my second cycle. So if there wasn't a phase shift, I'd be done. Those would be my key points. But there's a phase shift this time. So I'm going to add that pi to each of my points. So this is 2 pi over 2 plus pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. Oh, this is just pi. 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, 3 pi, pi over 2, 0, negative pi over 2, negative pi. If you duplicate it after, yeah, you can't do the negative after. You've got to duplicate it before and then do the phase shift. Only when there's a phase shift. Obviously, it's trickier if there's a phase shift. So now, like, look at the direction. This would be the smallest one. This is the smallest one, and then it works its way that way. So the smallest one, where did it go? My ID just hit the floor, right? Yeah, there it is. Okay. The smallest one is negative pi, and the largest one is 3 pi. And you want to kind of evenly space them out. So I've got negative pi, then negative pi over 2, then 0. So here's my 0, negative pi over 2, negative pi, and then I would go to the right. The next one would be pi over 2. That's this one. Then I go on the left-hand side. Pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, 5 pi over 2, and the last one, 3 pi.
I don't understand the negative. Like how you like changed it.
So the initial key points, like these, whoops,
Like I know like
these to these.
Yeah.
So once you get your first 5 key points, if you were only graphing 1 cycle, you'd be done. But this one's 2, which is so does your test. So you have to duplicate all of those points with a negative in front. If there's no phase shift, then that's it.
I understand what you do without the phase shift, but I don't.
So if there is a phase shift, we find the 5 key points before the phase shift, duplicate them to make them negative.
How do you do that?
Literally just say, it was pi over 2, make it negative pi over 2. It was pi, make it negative pi, 3 pi over 2, negative. Then add your phase shift, or subtract your phase shift if it was negative. So our phase shift was pi. So on every single one of these, we added pi.
Okay, so you do it to the positive
And the negative, yep.
Okay.
And then your pattern should be there. Like notice this is all 1/2 pi apart. They should be evenly distributed. Vanessa.
Why on the negative side did you add 2 pi over 2 to them? Is that just like making the denominator?
Yep. Just giving them the same denominator. We did it on the left too. There's 2. Because they were both pi. And they both had over 2. Okay, so now this is where it gets a little bit trickier. If you are going to get confused by the second cycle, then start with the first cycle, right? So start with pi being your home. This is like my home plate, right, or home base here, okay? This is sine, which means I'm going up. I'm going from 0, this would be my first point, up to the amplitude, which is 4, down to 0, down to the negative amplitude, back up to 0. If you want to plot all those points first, and then go back and do the other ones, you totally can. Because now at least I know, think about what was happening from the beginning. This is a sine curve. It starts at 0, it goes up, comes back down, and goes back up again. And that matches my sine curve. It's also one that, because of my phase shift, which was shifted to the right, pi over 2, or pi, sorry. Notice that my first point is pi. Everything got shifted over pi. So that's consistent with what I should have had. Then you can come back in and draw out what would happen next, which is coming down, up, and down. There's the second period of my sine curve. Then draw your asymptotes everywhere there's a 0. You're actually going to get 5 asymptotes. And then draw your parabolas, bouncing off the top and the bottom. And you end up with 4 curves.
So this one's a normal curve because it's not negative.
Right. And we didn't shift it up or down because there was no vertical shift. We just shifted everything to the right pi.
We can go back.
Yeah. All right, so here's the review. Again, it is like there's one of each in the beginning, so I would highly recommend you walk through each of those. Degree to radians, radians to degrees, arc length, and area of the sector. The beginning, these, no, you won't need to graph it. So I put to graph it so that you know where it's located, because that you need to know for later, but you won't actually have to graph that. Sorry, I thought you were asking about the sine one. 6-1. Then finding the sine, the cosine, and the tangent, all that stuff is on the second page, and the reverse. All that stuff should have been on your quiz. That's the first 2 pages. This is, all the solutions are posted too on the assignment itself. And then this is the big one. So you need to do as much of this as you need to do, okay? It took me a long time to do the review, which is why I posted it yesterday. Like, I actually worked out each question, and it took me a little bit of time, which means it's going to take you even longer. So please make sure you take the time to go through the graphs, because you're definitely going to need to do those. Make sure you take the time to identify the amplitude, the period, if there's a phase shift, if there's a vertical shift. Questions for me on any of that, or you guys just want to work? You guys from home, tell me what you need.
Will we graph one like number 1 on the review?
Will I graph it?
No, like on the test, will we have to graph one like that?
Sure. You mean 71?
Like number 7, it says the graph.
Oh.